Good evening. Hi everyone. Todd Keppel here with the Klamath County Museum. Hopefully we're getting started on time this evening with our Facebook Live program on the impacts of the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic in Klamath Falls and Klamath County. We're now in week 5 of Governor Kate Brown's stay home, stay healthy order. We've now missed 2 historical society programs that normally would have been given. Just last week we were expecting to hear from Pat O'Grady from the Museum of Natural History up at the University of Oregon. He was to come down to Klamath Falls and give a presentation on some archaeological work that he's been doing over in Eastern Oregon. Since we weren't able to enjoy that meeting and that presentation by Mr. O'Grady, the Klamath County Museum has decided to try to offer a few programs live on Facebook. We're pretty new at this. We've had some challenges, frankly. I've had the challenges making sure I hit all the buttons in the right order, so hopefully we're doing a little bit better with that tonight. I wanted to make mention of the fact that we're still mindful of the fact that while many of us have not really felt the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that there are many in the community who have. Not because they've been infected with the virus, although we know that some have, but many more people are dealing with just the effects, the fallout of our efforts to contain the virus. And so we continue to be mindful of all those folks who either have willingly made sacrifices or who have been called on to make sacrifices for the good of all of us. And so I'm still wearing my bandana. At least I'm trying to remember to take it with me everywhere I go and wear it in stores and any place where we're in confined spaces, just so that I make sure that I'm not spreading any germs that I might have whenever I cough or sneeze or just through talking. So I want to encourage everybody to pitch in and follow orders and comply with what's being asked of us to the extent that we can for the good of everyone. And thanks to those of you working up at the hospital or again in our elder care facilities, knowing that you're taking great strides to protect everyone's health, especially our elders in those facilities. So thanks a lot, guys, for what you're doing. So again, my name is Todd Keppel. I'm manager of the Klamath County Museum. We've been offering a few of these programs as a substitute for more informed and enlightened programming from people on various topics. We hope to get those speakers to come again sometime. We were going to have Moss Driscoll from the Bureau of Reclamation talk about the history of the Klamath Reclamation Project, because this is, after all, the 100-year anniversary of when they started construction of the Link River Dam. And then, as I say, Pat O'Grady from the University of Oregon was expected here last week, but wasn't able to make that presentation because we weren't able to have the meeting. Hopefully we'll get those guys rescheduled. And so tonight's topic is the impact of the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic here in Klamath County. I want to clarify a couple of things before we get started. One is I always like to lower everyone's expectations of the expertise that I might have on any particular subject, especially one as broad as a world pandemic, the worst pandemic in modern human history, with something like 500 million people around the world infected with that H1N1 Spanish influenza virus. Estimates of deaths ranged from 20 to 50 million. 20 to 50 million lives lost. These numbers from the Centers for Disease Control website. Number of lives lost in the United States, 675,000. I understand we just passed 50,000 with the coronavirus pandemic just recently in the United States. So thankful that we haven't seen the level of losses that they did back in 1918. But I do not want to pretend to be any kind of an expert on the pandemic of 1918. I don't even claim to be that much of an expert on local history. I'm not a historian, but I have been studying on this for a couple of days. In fact, I actually gave a presentation similar to this 2 years ago in 2018 for the Klamath County Historical Society. That was the 100-year anniversary of the Spanish influenza pandemic. And so I reheated that program, started working on it a few weeks ago. And of course, we all know a lot more about pandemics now than we did then. And so I think I have a better program to offer tonight. We invite questions and comments during this. You can send in questions and comments live on Facebook. Museum staffer Kristen Sonicson is going to be monitoring those comments, and she may respond to some of them. And if I see the comments going by on the screen as I'm doing the program, then I'll try to respond to them if I can. And of course, if you're watching this program at a later date, either on Facebook or on the museum's YouTube channel, you can comment or ask questions, and we'll try to respond to those as we notice that they're there. It's interesting to think about how the current coronavirus is impacting us today. It's interesting to talk with people wherever you go. Have we overreacted to this virus? Have we underreacted? How long will it be before we can even know whether our reaction has been appropriate or not? A lot of people in important positions, right from our own county health department and county commissioners up to the governor's office, and of course the Trump administration, dealing with a lot of issues. And you know, you can never avoid all the criticism when you're in positions like that, so we understand that. The one thing I know is that in 6 months we'll be in a lot better position to know what worked and what didn't work, and probably in 6 years we'll be in a better position. But all we can do now is, of course, the best that we can do. The program that I have for you tonight will feature mainly newspaper clippings. We don't really have any photos from the Klamath Falls area that illustrate the pandemic of 1918. I'm going to rely a lot more on newspaper clippings and a few photos for tonight's program. So the program may not be as interesting from a visual standpoint. I apologize for that, because there's just not that much to work with. But if you're interested in this topic, then I hope you'll find this information useful. I've got, like I say, a lot of newspaper clippings to show you. And the way I do this program is to just stick things in front of our museum smartphone and point a few things out and talk about a few things as we go along. This particular photo is one we used for publicity in the Herald and News, and I think we might have put it on our Facebook site. It actually shows the 1919 Klamath County Courthouse that for a time served as an isolation hospital. So I see some comments here that I've got some noise. I'm not sure what that's about. It's quiet here at home except for the clock ticking. So keep giving me those comments if there's some kind of background noise that you're hearing. Might be the refrigerator running or something. I'm just not sure, but I'll keep working on that. The courthouse that you see here, as I say, was used as an isolation hospital, but not in 1918. It was actually used a couple of years later during another influenza outbreak, and so I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the courthouse being used as a hospital a little bit later in the program. So I'm going to unplug the corded microphone that I'm using. See Kurt Lick give explanations or some advice here, which I'm not going to be able to follow. We certainly don't have a sound mixer. So I've tried unplugging the corded microphone and see if that has helped out. So let's get into the program here and look at a couple of things. First of all, wanted to share this clipping with you from 1918 in August of that year. A newspaper story from the Evening Herald newspaper of August 6, 1918. City pest house may be rebuilt. So there's a phrase that I was not familiar with. Sounds like our sound problem is getting a lot better, so appreciate those comments. City pest house. Well, that was a new one on me. I had to do a web search to find out what a pest house might be. I had guessed that it might be short for pestilence, and sure enough it is. Pest houses were also known around the country and in different countries as a fever cabin or such, someplace where folks who were ill could be isolated. So where was this pest house in Klamath Falls, I wondered. And so reading down through this story, it talks about how they were going to repair and renovate the city pest house at the foot of 2nd Street. Well, so then I wondered, well, what was at the foot of 2nd Street? What I know is there now is on the one corner, there's the old gas station that's been idle for years and years now. And then the Lake Park Tower Apartments, the old Willard Hotel. But I knew none of those structures were there in 1918. So I went back to see if I could find a photo from 1918 or thereabouts. And this is as close as I was able to get. I don't have the exact year of this photo, but it's from about that time frame. This shows a horse-drawn buggy going through the intersection of 2nd and Main Street. On the left side of the photo, we've got the old Van Fleet Electric building that was torn down a few years ago. And over here would be the Houston Opera House that was on the corner of 2nd and Main. And then at the foot of 2nd Street, which would have been coming down the hill this way, this would be where 2nd Street hits Main. There's the old Houston Hotel, sometimes known as the Livermore, but more commonly known as the Houston Hotel, and that was destroyed in a fire that occurred in 1920, September of 1920, almost 100 years ago. And then on the opposite corner were two houses that had been built sometime in the late 1800s. And so my guess, my hopefully educated guess, is that this structure right here, this two-story house, might have been serving as the pest house in 1918. This is the building that they would have been working on, perhaps knowing that there had been a report of an influenza virus spreading in earlier in the spring of 1918. But at any rate, the city was trying to get prepared to handle an outbreak of pestilence. At the time that the outbreak did occur, by the way, we had one fairly modern hospital in town. This was sometimes known as the Blackburn Sanitarium, but it was more commonly known as Klamath General Hospital up on Esplanade Avenue. This building still stands. It's an apartment building now. It was added onto somewhat in later years. Over here on the right-hand side of the building, they added a few rooms to it. So you can see this building when you drive up Esplanade Avenue right before you get to Pacific Terrace. But this was the one hospital that served Klamath Falls in 1918 at the time that the outbreak was about to occur. But of course, they didn't want to keep influenza patients in the hospital, and so that's why there was a separate isolation hospital or pest house where people could stay in order to be attended to. So here is a story from October of 1918, and it announces that the influenza is started in Klamath. This is from the Evening Herald newspaper, October 9th, 1918. The Spanish flu pandemic had gotten its start earlier in 1918, in the spring of 1918. They're not sure exactly where it might have started, perhaps even in my home state of Kansas. At Fort Riley in Kansas, there were a number of soldiers that came down with the Spanish flu. And, of course, the wartime activity with soldiers, servicemen traveling back and forth across the Atlantic and throughout Europe was an excellent way for the virus to be spread from country to country. The reason it was called the Spanish flu, by the way, was because Spain was the one place where there wasn't a news blackout during the Great War, World War I. And so it seemed like all the reports about the influenza seemed to be coming out of Spain, and so it came to be known as the Spanish flu. But it certainly was not to be blamed on anyone in Spain. It might have originated right in the Midwest. The CDC is uncertain about that. But at any rate, this dreadful announcement appeared in the Evening Herald newspaper in October of 1918. And just a few days later, October 12th, 1918, it was announced that all public places are closed for a week here. And so here's one thing that we noticed that was similar between this influenza pandemic of 1918 and the coronavirus of 2020, and that's that isolation and separation of people was the key strategy for preventing the spread of the virus. So one of the similarities, quarantining of those who became ill or those who had been exposed to those who were ill, and then closures of public buildings. And so the closures that were ordered here included, according to this story, all the theaters, the dance halls, pool halls, schools, churches, and public meeting places throughout the county, ordered closed by the health officer, Warren Hunt, in order to prevent the spread of the flu. And then it was just less than a week after that that the news was reported in the local newspaper, the Evening Herald, October 18th, 1918, of the first death known to occur from the influenza, Spanish influenza in Klamath Falls. The unfortunate fellow's name was A.H. Perry, lived on Lower South 6th Street. That would have been somewhere to the south and east of Maine. He was employed on the county road near Altamont and working for the county road department, and was taken ill and left this earth pretty quickly, left a wife and 10 children. And so that's just very typical of a number of stories that I'm going to show you very briefly here tonight. In that same day's newspaper, October 18th of 1918, the state health officer is banning meetings here. And so this, of course, does sound familiar, doesn't it, with what we're going through here today. Schools, churches, picture houses, or movie theaters, and public meetings forbidden until the spread of the malady, this malady, has been checked. And then here's another similarity between the pandemic of 1918 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Quite a discussion about masks. This is also in October of 1918. And the advice coming from health officials is that folks should wear a mask when they're out in public and mixing with other people. The wearing of the cloth mask is by no means uncommon now in many sections of the country, but the question is whether it would go over here in Klamath Falls. This next story is more sad news. Even though the headline in October, on October 24th of 1918, reported that many parts of the county were still free of the flu, that was not the case on the Klamath Indian Reservation. The report is that in more open parts of the county, Fort Klamath, Merrill, Lorella, Bly, Bonanza, etc., there is no influenza, a few light colds reported. But check out this part here, almost in the fine print, that says reports from the agency, and that would be the Klamath Agency on the Klamath Indian Reservation, say that there's a great deal of it among the Indians, and 11 deaths have resulted in the past 2 weeks. There's almost no reference beyond this of the effects of the pandemic on the Klamath Indian Reservation. It's interesting now that there's quite a bit of discussion these days about how the COVID-19 virus is affecting different sections or sectors of our population in different ways, with differences noted, especially with people of color and how they're affected by the pandemic. And yet here in 1918, we also see quite a difference in the way the effects of the pandemic in 1918 were reported between the white community here in Klamath Falls, as well as, and then contrasted against how it was reported on the reservation. Well, one of the pieces of advice that was given in 1918 during a time when there was no way to develop a vaccine and very few medicines that could be applied, with aspirin being about the only option for medication. The best way to combat the virus was to just take good care of yourself, including keeping yourself warm and especially keeping your feet warm. And so there were a number of advertisements that started popping up in the Evening Herald newspaper. This one is dated October 26th of 1918. So right as the virus was starting to take hold in Klamath, and the Winnick Company, one of the clothiers in downtown Klamath Falls, was advertising the best preventative of influenza is warm clothing, dry, warm feet. And so they're advertising products, socks and boots and so forth, in order for people to protect themselves. I've got a couple of more ads to show you. Here's one from the Modern Shoe Store at 727 Main Street in Klamath Falls. Protect your feet. Colds lead to influenza. And that was the common belief, even among medical professionals of the day. And then finally this ad from someone that we recognize. This ad by Kay Sugarman, one of the leading clothiers in downtown Klamath Falls at the corner of 6th and Main, the place that we now call Sugarman's Corner. He says, you men who have put off buying new clothes for the winter will find here unequaled opportunities for wonderful savings on your purchases. And so he also is encouraging the sale or the purchase of footwear, overcoats, and sweaters in order to protect one's health during the pandemic. This next story is about a young man from Klamath who was called to service in the Army in World War I. Man's name was Cecil Weeks, left Klamath Falls and made it as far as Vancouver when he took ill and from the influenza virus and passed away. His father and his sister, living here in Klamath, learned that he was ill, and they took off on the train and headed for Portland. Of course, in those days, a trip from Klamath Falls to Portland was pretty difficult because you had to ride the train south to Weed and then transfer to the main line on the Southern Pacific and then ride on up to Portland. And it took a couple of days to make that trip. And by the time the father and the sister made it to Portland, Cecil Weeks had passed away. Mr. Weeks was one of 17 young men from Klamath who died in the line of duty during World War I. And one thing that's often reported is that the number of soldiers who died from illness exceeded the number who died in combat. And that was actually true of the boys from Klamath Falls. Of the 17 young men from Klamath Falls who died in the line of service during World War I, at least 7 of them, 8 of them actually, died from illnesses. 5 died or from the Spanish influenza, 2 from scarlet fever, and 1 from another illness. As far as I know, maybe only 2 or 3 actually died in combat or from wounds sustained in combat. Here's another report. Actually, this report is out of order. It's from 1920. I'm going to set that aside and come back to that. We're now into November of 1918. And we read a report here about action that was being taken in order to take care of people who were coming down with the Spanish flu in Klamath Falls. There were a number of homes in Klamath Falls where everyone in the household were ill, and there'd be perhaps no one in the house that could be well enough to take care of others that were sick in the house. And so a committee was formed of primarily ladies that would travel around the community and even out into the surrounding countryside and help take care of people who could not take care of themselves. 40 women, part of this army of caretakers. And at the top of the list is a woman by the name of Miss Maud Baldwin, someone that we think highly of because she was daughter of State Senator George Baldwin, and at one point took over operation of the Baldwin Hotel from her father. Also down the list here, we see reference to a Miss Twyla Head right here. She, a couple of years later, would marry an attorney by the name of Charles Ferguson, and so she was known throughout most of her adult life as Twyla Ferguson, for whom Ferguson Elementary School is named. So these are all the ladies who showed the courage to go out and take care of people who had this terribly infectious virus in Klamath Falls in 1918. Here's another copy of that clipping, and I put a picture of our dear Maud Baldwin with the article. Back to the subject of masks, we see that in November of 1918, just about a week and a half after the order was issued for everyone to wear masks, we find that Folks in Klamath Falls were not very excited about wearing masks. The flu masks in Klamath Falls have not proved a huge success thus far. Now again, I wonder if that sounds familiar to us now in 2020. Whether the local residents placed little faith in their efficiency or whether they believed that the preventative was worse than the malady has not been definitely decided. But those who braved the amusement of their friends during the first day or two after the request was made found no following, and they shortly afterward abandoned them. The report continues. The Evening Herald office, and by the way, the Evening Herald was one of the predecessor newspapers of our Herald and News that we still have here today. The Evening Herald office looked like a masquerade ball for 2 or 3 days, after which things again assumed their normal aspect. Great efforts were put forth to induce Nate Otterbein, he I think was the editor of the paper, to adopt this covering, for although no one believed he would take the disease, it was hoped that a screen thus placed would act as a filter for his candid expressions when the linotype broke down. So a little bit of levity there on the part of the newspaper, but it does tell us that some things haven't changed in 102 years. So we still have quite a debate amongst us about whether we should be wearing masks when we go out. In that same day's newspaper, there was a more serious report that talked about how serious the influenza virus was now a couple of weeks after the first death had been reported. And a long story here about how serious the illness was, and also on that same day's front page of the newspaper, report of another death, S.H. Strong, who had been brought into town from the Barnes lumber camp up on the west side of Upper Klamath Lake. Of course, in the early 1900s, you had a number of logging companies that were operating camps in various parts of the county out in the woods, and the influenza virus struck in the camps just as well out there as it did in town. A few days later, a little bit more than a week later, this report in the November 14th, 1918 newspaper, back to the subject of masks, with the question being asked, now, could these boys have been from Klamath? The dateline is Portland, where soldiers were being gathered up for military duty, and a number of soldiers from Eastern Oregon, probably including some from Klamath, would have reported there. And an officer asked the boys why they were not wearing their masks, as they had been ordered to do. This was the question put to a number of Eastern Oregon drafted men who arrived en route to Camp Lewis. Their response was that we are wearing our masks. To prove it, they pulled up their trousers, and sure enough, the masks were tied around their legs. A question as to why they wore them there brought the answer, the order did not say where to wear them. The men were sent home Tuesday morning after having been housed at the Imperial Hotel Monday night. So another bit of levity there. Certainly does sound like something that might have come out of Klamath Falls, I do have to say. Another 10 days has passed, and now we're into November, late November, right around Thanksgiving time of 1918. And a new wave of the flu is now striking the town, where there had been a report that maybe the illness was leveling off. There were 36 new cases of the Spanish influenza reported by the physicians of the town. The mayor believes that to throw down the bars now, that is, to relax the restrictions, would be liable to bring about a situation worse than existed heretofore. And doesn't that sound familiar as the debate goes on around the country today about whether restrictions and precautions can be eased, whether that might just start another wave of the virus. Now, one of the saddest stories locally is this one of a woman who contracted the illness right at the end of November. This is a report from the November 29th, 1918 Evening Herald newspaper. A woman who had just given birth to a baby was stricken by the influenza. Mrs. Ida Hefner, the wife of R.R. Hefner, passed just within hours after giving birth to her child. And that was not the end of the sad story, because the very next paper to come out on December 2nd reported the death of Mr. Hefner and the baby that had just been born. And so the husband, the father, were going to be buried with the wife. They're buried up in Linkville Cemetery. So the parents both dead, the newborn child. There were two other children that were surviving. I've never been able to learn what became of the two children that survived. It would be interesting to find out what happened to those two children. But how sad it was that within just a matter of hours, really, a couple of days, man, wife, and newborn child wiped out by the flu. We were so taken by this story that we decided to portray this couple in a museum-sponsored program up at Linkville Cemetery, a popular program that we do called Night at the Cemetery. And we got a couple of experienced actors from the Linkville Theater, Jennifer Johns Palmer and Jason Eisenbeis, to portray Mr. and Mrs. Hefner. They didn't have a real baby for this act. They used a doll for their act. But Jennifer and Jason did a great job of dealing with that very difficult story of the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918. Yeah, Darren Rutledge has commented to make sure that we keep our pandemic straight here, because there are so many similarities between the 1918 pandemic and the COVID virus, COVID-19. Moving into December, we have a return now to folks being asked to wear masks. No report on how well the second request did. A policy has been adopted by the health board and supported by city and county officials in order to encourage people to do what they could in order to contain the Spanish influenza pandemic here in Klamath Falls. I'll show you a list of what some of the points of the policy were. All influenza patients had to be isolated. All prospective patients, that is people who had been exposed, had to be isolated for about 14 days. We're now isolating for 14 days, the last I heard. And then all physicians ordered to make reports to the county health officer about any cases that they were treating. And then finally, some rules for citizens. Full observance of the following rules are required of the citizens of the county. First, keep your bowels open. Okay, I guess that's always good advice at any rate. Secondly, take a bath every day. More good advice. Get lots of fresh air. Big believer in that. Eat plain, nourishing food. Avoid alcoholic stimulation. And here it is. Keep your feet warm. So you might want to make sure you've got good socks and boots. And if you have to, go down to one of the clothiers and get yourself some nice wool socks. Avoid chilling of the body. Gargle frequently. As you can see, this was the best that they had at the time. No medications and no way to develop a vaccine with the technology and information that they had back in 1918. So here's a bit of good news. We'll have more bad news for you, but in late December, on the day after Christmas, the newspaper finally had some good news that the ban had been lifted. And the story leads, "The city is open, hurrah, hurrah." And here again, we can identify with this in 2020. I know a lot of us are champing at the bit to see the restrictions lifted, and so we can get out and gather again and not have to wear our masks and so forth and so on. But we do have some more bad news coming. The city health officer tried to keep everybody focused on maintaining good health, and he published this, what I guess today we would call an opinion piece, pleading with Klamath Falls to clean up the city, not only to sanitize things around the house, but just to give the city a more beautiful look. And so he makes a rather lengthy appeal here in the Evening Herald newspaper, renowned in January of 1919, about the importance of having a beautiful and clean city. Now, one of the things that gentlemen did back in the late 1800s and early 1900s is they would sometimes write a poem in order to help illustrate their point. And actually, Dr. Shalay, the county health officer, did that at the tail end of this article. So I'm going to read a couple of stanzas of the play, but I'll have you look at a picture of Dr. Shalay while I'm reading so that you can just picture this learned gentleman who is making a plea with the people of Klamath Falls to clean up the city and to keep things around the house clean. He writes, Oh, Klamath Falls, my Klamath Falls, with lakes and woods and snowy walls, health and pride now on thee call. Oh, Klamath Falls, my Klamath Falls. And he has a couple of more stanzas. The last stanza reads, O Klamath Falls, my Klamath Falls, for you I'll don the overalls and save you from a loathsome fall. O Klamath Falls, my Klamath Falls. Submitted by Dr. A. Shalay, fairly new to town at the time and appointed the county health officer. And he's another kind of one of our heroes in local history for a number of reasons. He befriended many members of the Klamath Indian tribes. They came to him for treatment. Many of the objects from Dr. Shalay's office are on display in the county museum, the gift of some of the survivors, or the descendants of Dr. Shalay who still live here in the area. Ann McGill and Lynn Long specifically gifted those materials to the Klamath County Museum. So if you want to pay Dr. Shalay a visit, just come on down to the museum as soon as we open, whenever that might be. Well, we want to move on now towards the conclusion of this program. Another incident occurred, another wave of the virus hit in January of 1919. And at first it was reported that there were just rumors that were being spread around the town, and that the outbreak was not nearly as bad as the rumors had it. I see a comment there from Dr. Novak, former Museum Foundation Board member. Good to hear from you, Jim. And he points out that Dr. Shalay had a health spa. Actually, I think we could refer to it as a private hospital up on Main Street, a little bit to the east of where the Ella Radke Pool is now. That building still stands, by the way. So, Jim, good to hear from you, and thanks for chiming in with that. So it's announced then, just a couple of days later in the paper, that drastic steps are going to have to be taken in order to combat this new wave of the illness. There's a report here that the cases are being exaggerated, but we're going to see that it actually was another pretty serious outbreak, another wave of the Spanish flu. This also from the January 14th, 1919 paper, that a new isolation hospital is going to be fitted out. We talked about how there was one at the bottom of 2nd Street. This one is going to be over on Crescent Avenue, sort of in the area where KU is now. Of course, KU didn't exist at that time. The county had built a courthouse where KU is now, a courthouse that they never got around to using. But it was near that area, which, by the way, was kind of on the outskirts of town at the time, that the health board had secured a lease on a house, the home of S.P. White. I haven't nailed down exactly where that house was, but anyway, many of us know where Crescent Street was. And then the next day, a new feature in the Evening Herald newspaper, a daily report on the influenza situation. Each day, the newspaper would publish a column with complete information, local information, including people who had come down with the illness. And so in this first report, we see a fairly lengthy list, names of people who had the illness. And there's one name on here that, again, we recognize. It's this name right here, Kiva Sugarman, the clothing merchant who had been selling boots and socks. He had come down with the illness. We are happy that Sugarman survived the illness and continued to sell clothing in downtown Klamath Falls for many years. He was the one that had the slogan in his advertising, "I ain't mad at nobody." It was on the store of his, the outside of his building, and in most of his newspaper ads. But a lot of people coming down with the illness, including a lot of kids. The 1918 pandemic was especially hard on young children, as well as people in their 20s, and then older people as well. So compare this with the way things are treated today. We see that statistics are being reported very readily, where in 1918 they only had the daily newspaper to rely on. Now reports are generated daily and accessed over the internet or by email, like this report that comes from our county health department. My longtime friend Valerie Lane is the one who's tasked with sending out this email whenever there's news to report. And someone at the county has been generating very helpful graphs that show the trend line here, the number of cases that we've had. Fortunately, looks like we're seeing a downward trend from a spike that we had in early April, and this is the average number of active cases, hopefully trailing off. Now, there might be some people who say, well, that just proves that we don't need to be so concerned and be wearing our masks and all that. But another way of looking at that, I dare say, is that we can be thankful that we're seeing a downward trend, and it may very well be because there have been people that have been following the guidelines and keeping distance and so forth. And then another graph here showing the number of cases affecting females more than males here in Klamath County. Although nationwide, my understanding is that that men have been having a harder time dealing with the illness than females have. But again, I don't want to claim to be the expert here. I suggest you contact the county health department to clarify anything there. Well, we do want to move along here. I see we're almost 45 minutes into this program, which is much more than I had hoped for. On January 18th, Dr. Shalay published his daily report with a list of just 3 people who had the illness, but he makes an impassioned plea here. He says the fact that there is shown a decided improvement in the health conditions will not warrant any relaxation in the matter of strict quarantine. Every person quarantined should strictly obey the orders of the quarantine officers, and if anyone is caught violating these orders, they should be immediately sent to the pest house. If you are just joining us, we talked earlier in our program about the pest house being another phrase for the isolation hospital. Remember, everyone is on his honor, and if anyone ceases to have honor enough to protect his fellow citizens, then let him have the remedy of the pest house. So strong words from Dr. Shalay. I kind of think of Dr. Shalay as maybe being our Dr. Fauci of the first pandemic in 1918, advocating for everyone to follow the advice for social distancing and isolation. Here's a report. I'm going to show you just quickly some reports of people who passed away in 1918. By the way, I saw a comment there from Carrie Smith. Carrie, could you send me an email about the Hefner family that you apparently know something about? I'd love to follow up on that. Okay, so a fellow up in Fort Klamath succumbed, a man by the name of Joseph Vose in Fort Klamath. He had come to the Klamath area and married into the Melhays family, a prominent family up in the Fort Klamath area, and also had a connection here in Klamath Falls. He was the brother-in-law of John Hessig and also the brother-in-law of Dr. Shalay, the health officer that we've been referring to. And so at the very time that Dr. Shalay was dealing with so many issues here in Klamath Falls, he lost a member of his own family. Here's a report of Mrs. Harry Kinney at 604 9th Street, dying from influenza. Here's another report. These are just almost one day after another in the local newspaper. Every evening when the paper came out, people would look to see what the status was. Even as of today, we might be glued to our televisions or laptops or other devices in order to find out what the latest news is. And so the very next day, Fanny Brown has been called to her last rest by the Grim Reaper. A few days later, about a week later, a young man is reported to have passed away, Joseph Pizarro, a young man, 23 years of age. This man was not well known in the community, except that he was a Frenchman and that he had been an employee of the Pelican Bay Lumber Company. The final report submitted by Dr. Shalay for the newspaper came on February 1st of 1919. By this time, the next wave of the virus was starting to wind down. Not very many cases to report. And so this was the last day that Dr. Shalay's report was published. I've got here a list of all the names that I could find of people who passed away in 1918 or early 1919 from the influenza outbreak here in Klamath County. There would be one case in Modoc County that I might mention. But there's Mr. Perry, as we mentioned, the first Klamath Falls resident to die of the Spanish flu. There's the 11 deaths up on the Klamath Indian Reservation. No other reference that I could find in 1918 or 19 to the reservation. But here's the list of others. Didn't know Mr. Pickett's first name. They just reported that a Mr. Pickett working in the Pelican Bay camp had passed away, another lumber camp operator. There's Nicholas Kennelly on Dry Lake. I presume Ryan Bartholomew, I wonder if you'd agree with me, that's probably the Dry Lake that we visited some years ago down in Modoc County, south of Tionesta, south of Tule Lake anyway. And so altogether, about 40 individuals named here. There may have been more. Some of these may have died from complications that were connected with the Spanish flu. Not very many names that we recognize here. The Motzenbacher family was a prominent family, and I think there might still be a Motzenbacher or two here in town. And finally, Harry Lemler, who passed away. He had recovered from the Spanish flu, but then took ill about a month later and passed on. Interesting history there. We also portrayed him in Night at the Cemetery a couple of years ago. Moving on now to 1920. This is a clipping from the Evening Herald, February 21st, 1920. Another wave of flu came through the community. I don't know how many of these were from the Spanish flu. There was another wave of Spanish flu that went around the country in the fall of 1919. This might have been another strain of virus, but here's a report about deaths among the Native Americans on the Klamath Indian Reservation. There is a report that as many as 5 or 6 a day were passing on the reservation. The Herald reports here that those might not be the facts, that they try not to print uninvestigated rumors, and yet they felt that it was necessary to at least mention that there were so many deaths on the reservation. And then I've got a partial list of tribal members who passed away. Some tribal members may represent some names here. The Faithful family, I believe, out in the Beatty area, lost a couple of members there. So again, though, getting back to 1920, and that was during that time when Klamath County was having a ferocious battle over courthouses. There was the old original wooden courthouse that had been built in 1888, and then the county in 1912 started a new courthouse out on the east end of town, the northeast part of town, I guess we'd say, where KU now stands. They started a courthouse there and didn't complete it, and then in 1918, this courthouse was built, with construction being finished right at the tail end of 1918. The battle over the courthouse was so fierce that this building sat idle for a year until the influenza epidemic struck in late 1919 and into 1920. And since the courthouse was sitting vacant, it was decided that this structure would be used as a temporary hospital. And so for some time, I think it was perhaps just a month or so, influenza patients were kept in the old county courthouse. This building stood where our current courthouse is. They did finally occupy this courthouse. It was used as a overflow school for a couple of years, but then I think it was in 1922, Bob Busby mentioned this earlier in the day, 1922, when they finally started moving into the courthouse. I think the county clerk was the first one to decide to move their materials into the courthouse. So that's all I have to show you for this evening. I want to, again, apologize for sound problems we had at the very beginning. Seems like we just cannot quite get everything to go right here, but appreciate your patience. I think we'll do maybe one more of these programs. They're pretty fun to do, and we've had a good following tonight and lots of great comments. Kerry Smith reports that he got his homework assignment done already, and so appreciate that, Kerry. In 2 weeks, I think we'll come back and do one more program. Why don't we come back to the subject of schools? We did rural schools a couple of weeks ago, so we might finish that topic up and deal with some of the early schools here in Klamath Falls and the immediate area. So we'll do that program 2 weeks from tonight. We hope you can join us. Again, my name is Todd Keppel. This program has been presented by the Klamath County Museum, and we're so grateful for everyone who's tuned in tonight and all of those who might be watching later on Facebook and YouTube. You'll find our other programs that we've already done on our YouTube channel. So everybody stay safe, wear your masks, keep your distance, but let's stay connected, and we hope we can see you at the museum before too long. Thanks, everyone, and have a good night.